everybody. My name is Michelle Findlay-Olynyk, and I'm a software engineer at Google. Today, I am very excited to get to talk to Mary Robinette Kowal about her recent book, The Relentless Moon. So Mary Robinette Kowal is an accomplished science communicator and current president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. She's part of the award-winning podcast Writing Excuses and is the recipient of the Astounding Award for Best New Writer. Her stories appear in Asimov's Uncanny and several years' Best Anthologies. Mary Robinette is also a professional puppeteer, performs as a voice actor, records fiction for authors including Seanan McGuire, Cory Doctorow, and John Scalzi. Her novel Calculating Stars, which is the first of the Lady Astronaut series, is one of only 18 novels to win the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus awards in a single year. So today, we are looking forward to talking about her Lady Astronaut series and The Relentless Moon. For those of you who are watching on the stream, please feel free to add your questions into the YouTube chat. Mary Robinette, over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here being virtually.
Definitely in this day and age, they're all virtual meetings. I'm very excited to get to talk to you. When Katie told me about the Lady Astronaut series, I stopped her as soon as I heard Lady Astronaut, and I was like, I am in. This sounds so exciting. So I'm very excited to talk to you and to get to, I guess, fangirl about space for a little bit.
I'm always happy to fangirl about space.
It's so hard not to. Would you like to talk? Would you like to start with a reading?
Sure, let's do that. And also, just in case anyone here's a very tiny cat that is Elsie, who may or may not make an appearance. I was told that cats are especially welcome at Google. So if you see a little calico join us, or just hear her, she's in studio, as it were. So the section that I'm going to read to you from The Relentless Moon is fairly deep into the book, but it's mostly spoiler-free. Tried to pick something that was not huge in spoiler action. The things that you need to know leading up to this are that my main character is Nicole Wargan. There's signs of the cat. Nicole Wargan, she's an astronaut. In 1952, 10 years before the start of this book, there was a meteorite that slammed into Washington, D.C., which kicked off the space program fast and early. And right now, our team is en route to the moon. There's a lunar colony. It's like 250 people. Normally, this is a totally routine run, but the pilot is sick with food poisoning, and so they have a rookie in the pilot's seat who will be making his first lunar landing. Also, I am the audiobook narrator for these. I do that as day job also. So I will be deploying many of these special effects that we use in the audiobook. You'll see what I'm talking about when I get there. As the deorbit burn kicked in and gave us gravity for the first time in 3 days, my seat slapped against my back. That was a little rougher than necessary. I slid side to side in my seat as we oscillated around in yaw. Before I had time to tense, it settled out, and then the burn vanished. I bit the inside of my lip and stared past Imelda to the window. There was nothing wrong in the view to give me a sense of pace or altitude. It was just a subtle sense of wrong. Don't misunderstand. The approach to the moon is always a little different based on where we are in orbital cycles, but there are still rhythms and patterns. An oscillation wasn't completely out of the ordinary, and in fact, Jasira's ship had experienced severe oscillation on her first landing. It could be anything from a little debris to a cranky thruster to a gauge to pilot error. If Eugene had been flying, I wouldn't have been worried. But he was strapped into a couch at the front of the cabin with cracked lips and an unhealthy gray pallor. The International Air tapped Michael Lind to co-pilot. 2 rookies to bring us in because God forbid that they let me fly it. At least Helen had stayed put in the NavComp seat, so they had a veteran up there. She'd keep them on course and could compensate for burn errors. Artemis, Translunar Shuttle 1093. Kurt's call to Lunar Mission Control sounded as calm as if this wasn't his first landing.
TLS 1093 Artemis, this is Deanna Whitney on Capcom.
Good. I liked her. She was level-headed and wicked smart. And then I remembered that her husband had been at the Astronaut's Husbands Club the night that Nathaniel was poisoned.
How do you read? Loud and clear. Her horizon checklist right on time. Our radar indicates 15,200 meters paraloon. Our visual altitude checks out steadying at 16100. TLS 1093, your state vector is good. Perfect ground track. You are go to proceed with landing. Roger. Downstairs, we are making our final approach.
Kurt said.
Flight attendants, stop your beverage service and prepare for landing.
No one laughed. I wanted to yell at him to concentrate on flying. Eugene cracked jokes when we were sitting on the launch pad waiting, not during actual flight. I tightened my grip on my harness. Kurt was so young. A moment later, Mikey said, AELD, control circuit breakers. Deca gimbal AC closed. Gimbal enabled. Rate scale 25. I shifted in my seat, picturing the cockpit. I'd done 5 moon missions back when the Corps was small enough that they had let women fly sometimes. It would be fine. Everything would be fine. On my first landing, we'd had no problems, and there was no reason to think that the new kids would either. Helen said,
Your alignment is go on the AGS. On my mark, 3:30 until ignition. Roger. Mark.
Those 3 minutes and 30 seconds stretched out to fill the black void of space. Across the aisle, Ahana had her fingers dug into the knees of her spacesuit, and I couldn't think of anything to reassure her. I kept finding myself pointing my toes like I was about to go on point and had to force my feet to relax over and over. It felt like longer than 3 minutes and 30 seconds. It always feels like longer.
Thrust translation. 4 jets, balance couple on. TTCA throttle minimum. Throttle auto CDR. Standing by for...
The engine kicked the seats against us. Somewhere in the cabin, one of the Algerian contingent murmured a string of Arabic that sounded like a prayer.
Pitch 212, yaw 37.
I waited for the sideways thrust of the yaw maneuver, and it didn't come. Helen's voice sounded a little more urgent.
Kurt, pitch 212, yaw 37. TLS 1030, we're showing you coming in high. The controller is not responding.
His voice still sounded dead calm.
I've lost attitude hold. I'm having to manually maintain all of my rotational input.
Even the rookies understood enough that the cabin filled with tension. None of us spoke. Even though we weren't in the CM, keeping lines of communication clear was paramount. The control failure meant a lot more mental overhead in keeping the vehicle aligned. Up at the front, Eugene reached for his shoulder straps and stopped, clinging to the webbing. I knew the feeling. I wanted to unbuckle and Superman to the front to help. There were ways to compensate for failures in the control system. Kurt and Michael had both been pilots before joining the IAC. They'd had the years of additional astronaut training that our colonists hadn't. They could handle this. Assuming the ship hadn't been sabotaged, of course. Assuming this was a recoverable error. From the front of the ship, Eugene's voice was ragged but calm.
Crew, seal helmets and check your restraints.
Around me, dozens of helmets clicked shut. I slid my visor down, sealing me into suit air. If there was a breach, we'd be protected from vacuum. If there was an explosion, well. In the comms, our collective breaths hissed and popped as we triggered the Vox at different intervals. As long as people were breathing calmly, the voice-activated channels would stay quiet, but I didn't bet on many of the colonists breathing easily. Gravity seemed to come from our left as Kurt used 2 thrusters to spin the ship to the correct position. He'd burned through a lot of fuel doing it this way, which made the margins for landing uncomfortably close, but he'd get us down.
After yaw around angles, S-band pitch, -9 yaw, +18. Copy. Looking good.
I let out a little breath in relief, but just a little.
Beta, arm, altitudes are a little high.
Mikey sounded as if this weren't any more exciting than a Methodist mumble.
I'm getting a little fluctuation in the AC voltage now. Roger. Might be our meter?
That would be an easy way to crash a rocket. You wouldn't even have to damage an engine, just cause the instrumentation to fail. But that was okay. We'd trained to fly with visual only. They knew how to do this.
Stand by. Our position checks downrange show us to be a little long. Compensating.
A moment after Kurt spoke, a quick burn kicked our seats against us and stopped.
Good.
Now I could hear the relief in Mikey's voice.
We got good lock on. Altitude lights out. Delta H is -2900. Artemis Base, are you looking at our Delta H? TLS 1093, that's affirmative. It's looking good to us. 6 + 25, throttle down. Roger. Copy. 6 + 25.
I looked down, surreptitiously checking my Omega watch strapped to the outside of my suit. Imelda caught the motion and raised her brows in question. I shook my head at first, then turned my mic off and leaned over to press my helmet against hers. Tracking the burns. They're doing great. Right on time, we lurched forward as Kurt throttled down. We yawed a little, but it felt as if the course held mostly steady.
AGS, PGN, pings look real close. Manual attitude control is good. That thruster came back online.
No, don't trust it. Intermittent engine failure. Sure, maybe that thruster was back online for good, or maybe it was going to fail again. I curled my fists inside my gloves, and only a good manicure kept me from digging through the tips.
600 meters? 600 meters into the AGS, 47 degrees.
As Mikey spoke, I turned to look out the starboard window. The horizon of the moon filled the starboard side. I reached across the aisle and nudged Ahana. She jumped at my touch. I pointed toward the window, and her mouth rounded in astonishment.
35 degrees, 35 degrees, 230, coming down to 7.
The stark, beautiful craters and shadows scrolled past. Scale was impossible to tell without an atmosphere to soften the distance. In photos, the moon always looks gray, but the color fluctuates to include tans and bright whites, depending on where you look.
165 meters, down at 9, down at 5.
In the distance, Brannan Crater rolled into view. In the shadow of its rim, an artificial light shone with the presence of humanity. The entry dome at the Marius Hills outpost, where they were building a massive habitat inside a 40-kilometer lava tube.
We're pegged on horizontal velocity, 91 meters, down 1.06, 14 forward.
We were coming in a little fast for my taste, but still within parameters.
On 1 a minute, 0.45 down.
Beyond the windows, our shadow came into view, fluttering over the rocky surface. People gasped in unison, as if we had rehearsed it. Honestly, it didn't matter how many times I flew home. That first view of shadow made my chest loosen in wonder.
15.25, down at 0.76, 6 forward.
I lifted my arm to point as the first dome of the Artemis base slid into view, glowing with life on the surface of the moon. Ahana was already leaning forward against her restraints to see. The ship kicked sideways, snapping my arm against the side of my seat. We changed vectors again, restraints gouging into my chest so hard it knocked the breath out of me. I wheezed, staring out the window as dust billowed past it. The ship slammed down. Even through my helmet, metal groaned as the entire ship torqued way out of specifications. Bundles and CPK bags tumbled past in an avalanche, accompanied by disembodied yelps of pain. Over it all was the persistent blare of the decompression alarm. We stopped moving. 1/6 gravity settled us in our couches.
Touchdown.
Kurt swallowed audibly on the microphone.
We have touchdown.
The depress alarm still sounded. We were in our pressure suits for exactly this reason. It would be all right. We would need to evacuate. Normally, I wouldn't worry about my luggage, but I had a package to deliver, and it was gone. My entire CPK bag was missing. It must have been jarred loose on impact. Oh, shit. I shook my head inside my helmet. Worry about that later. Get everyone off the ship first. Someone was trying not to cry, a disembodied breath catching and failing to stay silent. My arm ached like fire, but I dragged in a breath, trying to project calm. It's okay, people. That was rough, but we're down. Just stay put while they shut down the rocket lurched violently. Adrenaline flooded my system. We were down, so why were we still moving? I looked out the window and the horizon tipped sideways. With a scream of metal I could feel through my seat and hear in my teeth, the entire vehicle slowly canted sideways. In 1/6 gravity, that's a long time to fall. So, that's the end of that chapter. No cliffhangers or anything. Why would I do that to you?
So I just love so many things about that section. A couple of things that pop to mind right away is the amazing technical detail. So from talking about touching the helmets to communicate without the microphones, to the domes on the moon, to all of the jargony detail that sounds very, very impressive. Also, that was an amazing reading. It felt right there, and it felt like it was so in Nicole's voice.
Oh, good.
I did. I really liked it. So I guess to back up for people who don't know the series, I think that was an amazing intro because, well, a few things. One, it shows you the amazing technical detail. It shows you some of the, there's a couple little hints about some of the more mystery and twisty elements that are going to show up in this book. So I think it gives people a good taste of what it's going to be like to read the whole thing. So a couple of questions then for you. What was the most, there's so much technical detail. What was the most difficult to research, or what did you have to put the most time in to really feel like you got right?
So it was actually, one of the things was designing the lunar base. A lot of the technical details, I have consultants who are actual astronauts and actual rocket scientists and rocket engineers. So I was frequently able to go to them and just say, hey, can you just fill in the blanks here? That particular sequence, all of the jargon is coming out of a shuttle approach. So I found a transcript of a shuttle landing, and also on YouTube there is the entirety of the first deorbit burn to touchdown point of view from inside the shuttle cabin, which is really cool. So I used that as coupled with, it's actually mixed with some Apollo landing stuff. Initially, when I wrote that, I did not have the Capcom. I didn't have the tower on the moon, and Katie Coleman, who's an astronaut and was shuttle era, pointed out that I really needed that. That they absolutely would have had that, and was like, "Oh, you are correct. Yes, you are." And which is when I folded in all of the shuttle stuff. So that stuff is in many ways easier because it's just working around stuff that's very known. Designing the lunar base was harder because there isn't one for me to riff off of. There's a lot of designs of potential ones, but there's not an actual base yet.
Yet, yes. So then bringing this back to more of the, I guess, overall world building, this series is sort of an alternate history of the beginning of the space program. You shift a few things, though. So if you look at the dates in this, I believe it's 1962. I believe.
This is, this begins in 63, actually.
63, sorry.
Yeah.
And obviously our space program didn't line up in quite that way. So one of the things that I noticed when I was telling people, I get to talk to this amazing author, it's about this alternate history, it takes place in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people would be like, wait, we weren't going to space that early. Do you want to talk about, I guess, some of the events that lead up to that and some of the changes you made?
Sure. So in the first book, and it's basically on the first page, so really not a spoiler, I slam an asteroid into Washington, D.C. in 1952. I actually adjust the timeline slightly before that because Dewey defeats Truman. had defeated Truman. So we already had satellites. We had 3 satellites up by that point in this timeline, in the Lady Astronaut timeline. And the reason that I did that is because I was very interested in working in a period in which women were still computers, or where I should say, when computers were still women, and so because my thinking was that what I wanted to do was write Apollo era science fiction at a time where if you wanted a computer in space, you had to send a woman. Which meant backing things up, because we have a very narrow window in which we have spaceflight capability, as well as before miniaturization and mechanical computers became really dominant. So I needed to have things happen a little bit earlier. So I did that. Yeah.
So Women Computers is actually one of the other reasons why I was so excited to read these books and then to talk to you. So I studied computer science. I've looked into the history of it. And women computers is something that, sounds weird, but literally it's like women who did math, who did these computations by hand before we had computers capable of them. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the research you did into that era?
Oh, yeah. So this is something that's been ongoing back to the earliest days of spaceflight. When you look at the formation of JPL out at Caltech, there were a lot of women involved in that. A really good resource for people who are interested in reading more is Rise of the Rocket Girls. And then a lot of people know Hidden Figures. Those 2 books they're great books. Like, there's the movie, yes, but the book is fantastic. But one of the things that a lot of people may not know is that when people are talking about when scientists were talking about how complex a calculation was, they'd talk about how many girl hours it would take to do a thing. And women as computers in the space industries before we could actually get off the planet in any way, shape, or form, with astronomy. The women who were doing all of the stuff to count stars and calculate the cyclical variations on Cepheids and things like that. These were all women, and of course the men were the ones who got the credit for it, because we know our history.
Yep. I guess going back to sort of Hidden Figures, which came out after you wrote the first book, so before you
Correct.
started talking about these, women computers involved in the space program. I believe I read in one of your AFTRA notes that you've based some of your characters on some of these real people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk about sort of how they're, before, some of this entered mainstream pop culture, how did these stories inspire you?
So one of the things that I was really struck by when I was reading Rise of the Rocket Girls, which I had access to before Hidden Figures, was how much more progressive and inclusive things were in many ways than I had been led to believe, and also how very 1940s and 50s some things were as well. But one of the things that early JPL had as a policy, there were 2 things that I thought was fascinating. One was they would not hire men for the computing department because they did not have as good a work ethic. They thought that they caused problems having them in the computing department because they were not. How did she phrase it? She did not use these words, and I am paraphrasing it because it's been quite a while. But the woman who was being interviewed said basically they were very privileged and thought that they had more power in the room than they did, which is like, I'm baldly paraphrasing something, but that was basically the problem. So they just didn't hire men for the computing department. Women could get hired for engineering, but it was very hard and they didn't get paid as much. And most of the time when a woman was hired with a comparable mathematics background and degree to a man, she would get hired for computing, which was not paid as well, and the guy would get hired for engineering. So there's on the one hand this super interesting progressive thing. It's like, nah, guys, and on the other hand, there's this, yeah, but ladies can't do engineering. They also had to hide if they were pregnant, even though there was nothing about doing math that was in any way, shape, or form dangerous. So they had to hide their pregnancies because they would get fired the moment that their pregnancy was became apparent. The other thing JPL had, which was great, and again, just fascinating to me and unexpected, in the 1940s, they had a policy that when you were being hired, one of the questions that you got asked was, how do you feel about working with Black people? And if you hesitated or said that you were not comfortable, they would not hire you, because they had Black engineers and they had Black computers, and it was totally desegregated. It was, everybody was working together as it should be. So they wouldn't hire you.
Wow, I had no idea that was part of the history.
Yeah, which is fantastic. Before Hidden Figures came out, when I was writing it, a lot of my beta readers were saying things like, oh, it's really great that this alternate history allows you to have these people of color in a room that they wouldn't have been in. I'm like, actually they were there. Or they would say, I really don't believe that even with an alternate history, these people of color would have been in the room. I'm like, they were there. They were literally there.
They actually were. Yeah.
Really for
this
true.
Isn't something I made up.
No, totally did not make this up. And not like one-offs. There were like multiple people. It was still heavily white, not going to pretend that it wasn't, but it was, there were a lot of people who have been erased from the historical record on that.
Yeah. So in your books, you focus on a lot of these people of color, when women, underrepresented groups, and you highlight their stories and their struggles. I guess, what's your view on sort of representation and really trying to share those stories?
So I've always thought that it was important. It has become more important to me, kind of the deeper into my career that I get. But specifically after writing these books, I have seen the impact that it has because of the number of women in STEM who have written to me and said, oh, yes, this is exactly the experience that I've had. And also the number of men who have written to me saying, oh, dear God, I didn't actually understand. And I do now. And then the other thing that I would say is that because I also deal with some mental health in there, I've had a lot of people, a distressing number of people write to me and say that they went and got help for anxiety or depression for the first time because they were able to use this book as a script. And that's, on the one hand, I'm profoundly grateful and humbled that that worked. On the other hand, that's not how you should get medical advice.
Definitely. I will say I also found it very meaningful that I guess a lot of the times heroes are presented as these perfect people who accomplish these great things and have no flaws. And seeing these representations of women who do have some of these struggles and still accomplished amazing things, not in spite of, but just that was part of them and who they were, I found that very powerful and moving. So I guess thank you for calling that out. Also in your afterwards, having all of these references and resources. So I suggest that everybody take the time to read those extra notes at the end. I found them fantastically informative. So thank you for that as well.
Good, because those are fun and also my least favorite part of the novels to write.
I like the context that you gave in a lot of those. I thought they were really valuable.
Oh, thanks.
As sort of a tie-in to the representation, and also I want to shift maybe to some of the pop culture references you have in there. The series is called the Lady Astronaut series, and the character in the first book, the main character, Dr. Elma York, goes on this show, Watch Mr. Wizard, which was a real show that I didn't know about, but my dad was like, I knew that show, and she inspires all of these girls to make Lady Astronaut clubs. So I guess do you want to talk about pop culture and including things like Mr. Wizard, as well as I think I've heard there's now Lady Astronaut clubs out in our world.
There are Lady Astronaut clubs. There's at least one. I think we're working on an Australian branch. So I was aware of Mr. Wizard. There was a reboot of it in the 1980s with the same man. And and there would be jokes about watch Mr. Wizard. He was basically the Bill Nye of his generation. But he was a real guy and had been a pilot in World War II and wanted to inspire kids to be interested in science. And the thing that was really interesting when I went back and watched the original Mr. Wizard from the 1950s, which again, there are episodes on YouTube. I think I linked to one of them. But he has little boys and little girls doing science. The premise is that he's this guy in the neighborhood and kids come over and they do science together, which in modern era sounds totally creepy. And at the time it was so wholesome. And the science is absolutely ungendered. Like many of the reboots that I've seen of varying things, it's like, hey girls, do you want to do science? Let's explore the science of perfume. And he's like, let's explore the science of capacitors. And a little girl in her sweater set and poodle skirt is like, well, resistance is caused by and just like absolutely no gendering. Clothing, yes. Capability, no, none at all. And so he had Mr. Wizard science clubs that any kid could join. And so the idea that I had was that he would that there was a need at the time for something that felt like it was targeted, that girls were welcome in, because just the Mr. Wizard, there is an inherent gendering in that. That can often unconsciously tell someone that they're not welcome, even if that's not the intention. Like the Lady Astronaut Club's the thing that it sounds like something that's just for women, and it's really anyone under the gender umbrella, wherever you are, can join. It's just basically, are you a fan of the idea of women going into space? Great.
I love the idea of those clubs, and I wished we'd had more of that when I was a kid.
Yeah. Well, the Lady Astronaut Club so far, pretty much all of those are all grown-ups. Anyone who wants to join, ladyastronautclub.com. You have to send in a self-addressed stamped envelope, but you get a membership card back in the actual physical mail.
I guess there's more of that going around, more physical mail these days anyway.
Yes.
So I'm a fan of sort of Easter eggs in pop culture, and you have a few nice little drop-ins, and I noticed a couple, and I'm not the most pop culture literate person in the world, and so I'm sure there are many I missed. So there are things like, in, say, the epilogue of the most recent book, just there's a reference to, a puppet show and talking to Mrs. Henson, which I was like, that's so cool! I know that! So do you have any favorites or anything that, people might have missed, but, if you're willing to talk about them here, that might sort of add a fun spin?
I am a huge Doctor Who fan. And so there is a Doctor Who cameo in pretty much every novel. Sometimes it's just in a universe. So in this particular universe, if you read book 1, Elma has to go see a doctor. And the key is, if there is a character who is a doctor who is only ever referred to as the Doctor without being given a name, they are the Doctor. So that particular one, the doctor she goes to see is this older Scottish man with gray hairs and bushy eyebrows, and who, if they happen to cast Peter Capaldi as that particular character, absolutely no copyright infringement is intended, but I would really enjoy that casting choice.
That's amazing. And now I feel really bad because I do love Doctor Who and I didn't catch it. So now I'm going to have to reread and make sure I find it.
My goal is that you don't go, that that it's there for people who are looking, and mostly for me, and for everyone else, that you don't feel like you're missing out on something. I think I've got a Star Trek reference in there, at least
Yes.
one. Ray Bradbury. All of the books that they are reading are real books that would have been
Yes.
available at the time. The inside of the book is probably a little different in this timeline, but
Still, I loved all those call-outs, at least the ones that I caught. I thought it did add just sort of an extra fun bit.
yeah.
Okay, so now to talk about the Relentless Moon specifically. So the previous two books focus on Dr. Alma York, and now you're sort of switching to a new character. So I won't get any details or any spoilers about the previous books, but Dr. Alma York's the first two, but we have Nicole Worgan in these ones, and
Yes.
she is a bit more of a polished character than Dr. York. And I think the feel of the books shifts a little bit. It's a little bit more mystery, a little bit more some thrillery cliffhangers. I guess one question is, when you decided to do this new one, did you shift to be more mystery because of the character, or did you find the character was a perfect fit for the story you wanted to tell?
Both. I knew that I wanted to be dealing with the all of the things that were going on Earth. So it is a parallel book to book 2, The Fated Sky. So they happen at the same time. And in Fated Sky, I refer to things going wrong on Earth. So this is like, because Fated Sky is a Mars mission, and so most of the time they're just in space. So this was like, well, this is all of the stuff that was going down back on Earth. So I knew I wanted to be dealing with politics. Nicole, as the wife of a politician, is well suited for that. And then it was also, tracking down the people who were causing problems. So it was always going to have much more of a thriller mystery aspect to it. But one of the things that I like doing personally when I'm writing and when I'm reading is trying to deliver the same but different. And so I didn't want to, like, if you want the feeling of The Calculating Stars or The Fated Sky, you probably reread those books. And if you're picking up this book, there are things that you want. Like you want competent women in space. You want a committed married relationship. You want a discussion of gender and racism and mental health. But otherwise, you're basically, it's like, please give me some adventure in space. That's basically what you're signing up for, in some form. And so, in order to deliver a different adventure in space, I basically switched genre, which is a trick that I learned in my first series, the Glamorous Histories, which is it's all disguised as Regency romance, and it's like we have a heist novel that's basically Jane Austen writes Ocean's 11. We have straight up romance in one of the books. So it's one of the things that I've learned is that a way to deliver a different experience is to sidestep into another genre.
Feel free to not answer this, but do you plan to keep going with Nicole, or do you plan to bring in other lady astronauts? I guess mostly I'm saying I hope you can keep going with this series about competent women in space.
There's a book 4 called The Martian Contingency, which will come out in 2022. That one I am going back to Elma, and it takes up about 5 minutes after the end of The Fated Sky. So, and it's all Mars all the time. So you will get to see Nicole via letters and teletype, but you won't actually get to she will not actually be on the page for that one. I have written multiple short stories that are set in this universe, so you do get to see other lady astronauts. I will happily write in this universe as long as they keep buying books from me. And will continue to just write short stories because I super enjoy that too.
So I guess to bring in, you mentioned the teletype there. One of the aspects that I thought was super cool from a technical point of view is there isn't real-time communication. So this is a lot more apparent on Mars. but there is still a delay talking, say, Earth to Moon.
Yeah.
I guess, how did you fit that in? And I guess one little thing, there's some neat bits about code in both books, if you would care to talk about that.
Sure. So when we are talking to the moon, it is a 2.6 second round trip. And that is actually long enough to notice and feel. Here, this is a thing that I would do in some of my book tour things. This we can mimic what this feels like. Go ahead, and we can just have a brief normal conversation, and I will pretend that I am on the moon. You don't have to change anything. I will handle all of it. So just ask me any question at all. Or
I guess, how did you come up with the idea to, add codes into there?
Well, one of the ways that I came up with thinking about the codes was thinking about all of the experiences that someone would have had from being in World War II, which many of the characters would have lived through. So that was a simple thing, and also I think codes are really super nifty and fun. And if you live your entire life in the public sphere, you wind up having codes to communicate. Like my assistant and I have a code so that I can tell her how long I want to talk to someone, or if she needs to extract me from a situation, without ever having to say any of those words out loud and make the person I'm speaking to feel uncomfortable.
I definitely loved the various ciphers used between the different characters, and some of them are very simple, but they're very effective.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
It really is a noticeable delay, and it really does sort of break up the flow of the conversation.
Yeah, it really does.
That's very
and
neat.
all I'm doing is I'm basically counting to 3 in my head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3, and then I go, and that's about 2.5 seconds.
Yeah, and then you get to react.
Yeah. When you watch astronauts who are on the ISS, when they're having communication with the Earth, they have a 4-second delay because of the way the satellite routing is.
Okay, yes, because I was like, they're closer than the moon, but with
I know,
the satellite routing, that makes a lot of sense.
Counterintuitive. Yeah.
Yeah.
I probably should have actually given them a longer delay than 2.6, but Apollo had 2.6, so I feel like I was justified in not adding in an additional delay for it being bounced around. But yeah, it's super, super weird.
So I think we're starting to get close to the end of our time, and we have a few audience questions. Are you?
Awesome.
So I guess one thing before we switch over to them, I have really enjoyed talking to you, and I have loved these books. So thank you for taking the time to chat with me and answer all of these questions that I've had for you.
Oh, thanks for asking really good, interesting questions that are different than the ones I normally get. And I'll also mention to the folks in the audience that I am happy to answer questions about anything. I am completely not shy about stuff. And if it's something that is off limits for one reason or another, I'll just say that. I won't be offended that you ask. But like Regency underwear, depression, puppets, space, how you pee in space, any of those things are fair game.
That was also an amazing technical detail that I guess I hope I never have to experience. And, never will get the chance to, but it's very cool. Okay, let's go over to our first question here. So this is from Karen Lynn. How did you decide to focus on science fiction as a genre? Have you published stories in other genres as well?
So there are 2 answers to this. One is the real answer, and the other is the public. Well, I feel like science fiction really allows us to take the natural world and spin it on its side, and so we can see the interconnective tissue, and that gives us more of a way to explore the human experience. While that is true, the actual answer is I love science fiction. It's what I grew up reading. I write fantasy, I write science fiction. I have written one mimetic, which is like real world natural story. But yeah, science fiction and fantasy are my happy place, and I'm writing books to amuse myself. So that is basically why.
You've amused me as well several times, so I
Excellent.
appreciate it. Okay, we have another one from James Williams. Will there be another short story spin-offs to the Lady Astronaut universe like Articulated Restraint?
Yes, there will absolutely be more of those. In fact, if you go to my website, RobinetteKowal.com, and under FAQ about Lady Astronaut, there is a list of all of the short stories and the order in which they occur. And I have a new one that will be coming out from Uncanny magazine, I think in January, which is takes place on the orbital telescope.
That is very cool. I look forward to reading that. All right, we have another one from Ruth Schultz. Love all your books. The Lady Astronaut books are my favorites. In the Lady Astronaut universe, have you worked out when the first child and babies are in space, are on the moon?
Yes, I have, and unfortunately, that is a spoiler for a future project. There's a and since I know that this is on the books and in the timeline planning, I can tell you that I have worked that out. But I cannot tell you when. I will tell you what I can tell you is what they plan. Their plan is to bring teenagers up first. Teenagers, post-pubescent teenagers first, because they are less vulnerable, to see how they react, then to move to prepubescent teens, and then to children, so that they can make sure that there are no adverse effects to the younger you are, the more vulnerable you are to early environmental shifts, and everybody is going to be in that centrifuge ring. That's one of the main reasons that they've been working on that technology.
So I guess this also just comes back to the incredible research you do. I assume you've researched and thought about what these effects would be. Are you willing to talk about the research, even if you don't talk about the plot points in the book?
Yeah. So there's a lot of it is that we just are very uncertain and don't know. There are things where they've done experiments with mice and other small critters that show that there are some aspects of weightlessness which you're like, oh, okay, this is fine, and other aspects where you're like, oh no, this is very bad. The biggest problem that we have with knowing how things will be on the moon or Mars is that there's not a good way for us to study limited, like lower gravity. There's some indication that even a little bit of gravity is enough to make things pretty okay. But that's extrapolating from the way plants behave. That's extrapolating from short-term studies. We don't have had no way to do a long-term study. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is hedge my bets on when we have to actually deal with that until after they set up the moon base that they're talking about doing. Like if the Artemis program actually works and we have a permanent presence on the moon, then we can start doing those long-term studies and we'll get a better idea. But there's no way to really get that data right now.
I guess, are you willing to place a guess for the science in your book?
I will. I place guesses, and I can place some pretty reasonable guesses talking to specialists. And actually, the fellows, James S.A. Cory, who's actually Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank, works really hard on getting that right in The Expanse. But again, it's all guesses. It's like, what happens to growth patterns when you are in the womb? You are more or less in a neutrally buoyant environment, but you're still experiencing gravity. Like there is still an up and down. So we think that the circulatory system will still be fine. We can make guesses about what's going to happen when someone comes from the moon back to Earth by looking at the way people from Earth react to gravity that is, 6 times greater than what we're used to. It's like what stresses the heart can take. So we can make some guesses about that. We can make guesses that the heart will be under tremendous strain coming back. We can make guesses that they will feel faint. We can make guesses that even with even with doing rigorous exercise and being strong enough, that their brain will not be calibrated to handle being. But these are all, these are all wild guesses. So
Yes.
I part of the way I hedge my bets is by putting a centrifuge in there and saying that they are trying to make it so that people can have at least 2 hours of Earth normal gravity every day.
Wow, that's very interesting, and I'm super excited to see how it all plays out in the books. We have another question from Alaya Hedge. Since you said you love sci-fi, do you have any particular favorite authors to read at the moment?
Yes. So N.K. Jemisin, I'm reading her newest book right now, The City We Became. I am also, I just finished reading the last year's, the most recent Nebula winning novel, which is Sarah Pensker's. Oh no, I've just forgotten the name of Sarah's book. It's so good. Why is my brain doing this?
I guess the good news is it's one of my favorite ways to find books is to go look at the award winners and just start reading through them.
Yes. Music for a New Day, which is uncomfortably close. It's basically 10 years from 2020. It's like 10 years from right now but she wrote it, like it won the Nebula and it came out last year. So it's weirdly and uncomfortably prescient, but so good. There's 2 books that are coming out. The Mask of Mirrors, which is coming out, I think it's November or January. I just blurbed it, and it's so good. Frequently, the books that I want to recommend are books that are not yet out.
Got to hold off for a few months at least.
I know. Yeah. Temi O. It's Song for a New Day by Sarah Pensker. Thank you. My assistant just sent me a secret message. But Temi O, Do You Dream of Terra 2? If you're interested in alternate history spaceflight, very good. Yeah, there's so many good books out.
So Ruth Schultz has another one. Also, I've been wondering, why did Elma have 2 PhDs?
She, because she gets bored easily. When I looked at the astronaut candidates, the real world astronaut candidates, there were a number with 2 PhDs. And what seems to happen to them is that they are taking enough graduate level courses simultaneously that it's like, well, if I do one more semester, then I have a second PhD, so may as well. And I'm writing this paper anyway, so why not do 2 dissertations? So that seems to happen to people, to a very narrow subset of people, I will grant, but it does seem to, and there are a disproportionate number of that narrow subset become astronauts. So that's basically why.
So as sort of a conveniently almost related question by Karen Lynn, how do you build the network of subject matter astronauts like the astronauts engineers to consult for your stories?
I basically just ask. Once you meet one of them, and prove that you are not exploitative and an evil person, they are very happy to open the doors to the rest of their network. With NASA, so I got lucky with the astronaut community because a friend of mine, Stacy Berg, who's a wonderful science fiction writer, and I should have actually mentioned when I was citing science fiction authors, Stacy Berg is so good and really, I think, underappreciated. But she was friends with Katie Coleman and asked me if I was on tour in Houston. And Stacy's like, "Hey, I know you're working on this astronaut book. Do you want to meet my friend Katie?" And I'm like, "Yes." And Katie was fantastic and just lovely and generous about answering questions. And then Kjell Lindgren, I met at the Nebula conference, which is the one that Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America puts on. He was our Toastmaster. And we struck up a conversation. At one point, he asked me what I was working on, which is a question that every author both loves and dreads simultaneously. And I told him it was Apollo-era science fiction. And he's like, "Really? I would be very interested in reading that." And I'm like, "I would be very interested in having you read that." So that, and then the rest of them, honestly, I just wrote to NASA, to their science communication folks, and I was like, "Hey, I'm working on this. Do you have anyone?" And people were super happy to pass me around. Not everyone is willing to talk to you, obviously, but enough people are that if especially if you can show that you've done your basic homework, and if you come in to ask them a question that makes them go, "Huh, I don't actually know the answer to that." Like, "Hi, I'm interested in the fluid dynamics of how does sweat behave in Martian gravity?" And you watch a fluid dynamics person or a human, someone who does human spaceflight go, "Huh, sweat, huh," and it's it's fun because then you get to have this really interesting conversation.
Yeah, it's a real puzzle that applies to their work, but that's also just really cool to think about.
Yeah.
All right. We're getting low on time, but we have one more question here. This is from James Williams. Was there a historical inspiration reference for the ladies' flying clubs, specifically the Black Ladies ones?
Yes, absolutely. The one of the characters, Miss Coleman, is my nod to Bessie Coleman, who was a very early woman. She was the first Black woman to get her license, her pilot's license. It was not legal for a Black woman to get her license in the United States. So she was a hairdresser. She saved her money from dressing hair, taught herself French, moved to Paris because it was totally legal in France, got her pilot's license there, and then came back to the US where she was able to teach and open up opportunities for other women. There's a great book called Black Wings, which looks at the history of African Americans in aviation, from the very first days up through spaceflight. It's fantastic, but yeah, the Negro flying clubs were absolutely a real thing. They had men and women's groups. They would do their own powder puff derbies, which were the women's races, cross country flying races. And it was seen as a really great career opportunity for young Black men and women. So yeah, absolutely, 100%. That's not something I made up.
We have one more question that just snuck in under the wire. We'll get this last one promise, from Yuki Jung. Some of my favorite snippets from your work around relationships, romance scenes, especially jokes. Do you have any favorite authors or recommendations for the romance genre?
So highly recommend Courtney Milan. Also, Elizabeth Boyle is a wonderful and delightful person. And then there's a bunch of people who are kind of right on the cusp. I love Diana Rowland. Technically, she is writing urban fantasy, but there's always this wonderful, strong romance element in her books, and she can really write smoldering scenes so well. Those are some folks that I tend to go towards when I'm picking up romance, which I love as a genre.
Okay, well, we are running. I think we're actually perfectly at time right now. So I just want to say once again, thank you for writing books that I love, books that I think raise important issues that I'm trying to get everyone I know to read. So thank you for coming to chat with me about this new book, Relentless Moon.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a delightful time chatting with you.